There we go. Is everybody seeing what I can see?
Yep.
Which is the slideshow coming up. Excellent. Now, I'm aware from Rodrigo that you guys will all have a little video in the top right-hand corner.
Or down the right-hand side, yes.
Yeah, if you could move... Oh, it's down the right-hand side. That's interesting, because when Rodrigo showed it to me, it's like a little stamp in the right corner. Because basically, he said to get people to move it to the left, because then it won't obscure as much of the text, if any of the text. Hopefully, none of the text.
Oh, I found you can move it right off the screen altogether.
Oh, excellent. Okay, that's fine. Then you don't have to stare at me. You can just look at my slides and hear me, which is even better. Right.
Or I can put it down the bottom. There's all sorts of weird things I can do.
Awesome. I would recommend the top left because I've tried to jiggle my slides around as best as I can so it won't obscure any.
Okay.
So, hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about what Peter and I actually have recently published on, and there's another paper under review which I'm also going to be talking about the basis of in this as well, because it's going to form something of a background paper, but I'll come to that. So I'm talking about climate change, climate disruption, specifically pertaining to our neighbours, the Pacific Islands. So first of all, I'd like to, as Peter has very kindly already done, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all meeting. And so I'm going to first of all go through the aims of this webinar, what we're doing, and then the background, specific issues facing the Pacific Islands, recent measures that they have been doing to try and adapt to and develop resilience to climate disruption. Then I'm going to look at mitigation versus adaptation. And then I'm going to go on to the real crux of the matter, which is the pending issue of what we'll call for now climate refugeeism, and hopefully open some discussions, some solutions, and where we go from here. So the aims of this webinar are to highlight what is an increasingly dire situation in the Pacific Islands, to discuss current strategies to adapt and mitigate to climate change, to tackle displacement owing to climate disruption, and to discuss where, as the ESIG and the PHAA, we might like to progress to try and help and maybe develop policy or advocacy in this area. So, as we're all probably aware, global warming due to greenhouse gas emissions it's pretty unanimous now among scientists. And as we know, this has huge both direct and indirect effects on human health, from the effects of temperature increases directly on cardiovascular systems, the effects of pollution on respiratory systems, the effects of increased storm and people becoming displaced. The speed of climate change is accelerating, and with it, the likelihood of us seeing climate refugeeism, so people who are forced to leave their home because of climate disruption, is increasing. And certainly when we look at it pertaining to the Pacific Islands, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States are close by. There are historical ties there, historical relationships and friendships. So, you know, we're set to be a key migration destination. And as we know, the Paris Declaration focuses, it doesn't really discuss voluntary migration as a method for reducing the potential for future refugeeism. And we know that whilst there may be the acute events, so such as the big storms that come in and storm surges that cause people to flee, there's also going to be a group, and certainly many in the Pacific Islands would favour this, who will voluntarily migrate before things reach absolute crisis point, before the rising sea levels are lapping their ankles. And one thing that I've noticed is that actually currently in this context is no agreed distinction between forced displacement and voluntary migration when it comes to climate disruption. So, going back to the Pacific Islands, we know that the big issues there, rising sea levels and storm surges, and projections are showing that Kiribati and Tuvalu may well be uninhabitable by as soon as 2050, which will be in our lifetimes. And then just as a side note, obviously all of these issues and displacement come with potential for battle over resources. So, we need to just bear in mind as well, whilst we're thinking about people who are displaced, the conflict might ensue as well, which could worsen these situations. So specifically for the Pacific Islands, there's currently 9.5 million people across the wide number of islands that there are. And we know the island populations are growing, and there's already high rates of immigration out of the islands. We know that migration, generally speaking, has mixed effects. There are positive economic outcomes, particularly for the countries receiving migrants, especially for places like Australia, because they are so strict on the skill of the people they're accepting. But then there's also issues of those people, you need to remember, who are coming into a completely different culture to their own, and that can have effects on their cultural identity. And then when you're looking at people who are feeling forced to migrate, or indeed refugees, again, you've got the issues of loss of cultural identity there. So the Pacific Islands are facing predominantly coral bleaching, coastal erosion, adverse weather events, and importantly, rising sea levels. And Tuvalu is set to be at the forefront of this. They're particularly vulnerable because they don't really have the capacity to adapt, because none of their land is more than 2 meters above sea level, so they're low-lying. Their shallow freshwater supplies can dehydrate easily in drought, or indeed become contaminated by rising sea levels. And the population is heavily dependent on fishing, and we know that obviously overfishing is also an issue around the reefs in the islands. So coral reefs, they provide resources for more than 500 million people worldwide. The Western Pacific coral reefs have declined by up to 50% and are continuing to do so at quite an alarming rate, as you can see. And this is due to, obviously, global warming and ocean warming, ocean acidification as a direct result of that, pollution, waste, and overfishing as well. And that brings us back to the food security issues there in the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands, their economic development, their food security and employment is quite heavily dependent on the fishing industry and on aquaculture. And we know that the ocean warming is also having an effect on fish reproduction. And some species of tuna, which are obviously an important dietary resource for these people, are already declining. So the decrease in coral reef fish, combined with the increasing population within the islands, is obviously for food security an issue. And there are projections that even the most well-maintained fisheries and ones that are doing fish aggregation to try and encourage fishes to come in will fail to meet the growing demand, both outside and things that are exported, and indeed food security within the Pacific Islands themselves. Then we have the issue of altered weather patterns. So we all know, preaching to the choir here, that you get increased frequency and severity of adverse weather events, such as tropical cyclones and loss of coral reefs as a result of those storms. Just as a side note, we're seeing it over in the States currently in their hurricane season now. I think they've got something ridiculous like 6 hurricanes circling around the Gulf area. And obviously these severe storms have a further impact on the coral reef barriers as well. Then you lose that protection for the low-lying coastal areas, keeping them more open to storm surges, which again has the knock-on effect of affecting soils, affecting water supplies, and obviously damage and displacing people. Temperatures are predicted to increase by a further 1.79 degrees by 2030. Obviously, the Paris Declaration is trying to keep it below 1.5, ideally. But Peter's shaking his head, so I think I might be wrong there.
No, you're right. The declaration was clearly to keep it under 1.5. The probability we're going to keep it under 2 is remote.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the ideal was 1.5. The worst case scenario was 2. I was saying 1.5 because it's below the 1.79, but obviously, we're not going to meet that. And then obviously Kiribati, Marshall Islands and Tuvalu, they have some of the highest rates of tuberculosis in the Pacific region, owing to overcrowding and poverty. As we know, it's tuberculosis. So obviously when you've got climate change related natural disasters, this obviously will displace the people closest to the coast. So then there'll be more overcrowding, even if it's just temporarily, but that will increase transmission of tuberculosis and other communicable diseases. And then on top of that, we've got the vector-borne diseases. They're climate sensitive and incidence increases in warmer and wetter conditions. So it's a little nest of many, many issues brewing there. And then finally, the golden egg. Sea levels are rising at 3.3 millimeters a year, and that's forecast to rise to 5 millimeters a year. Again, this stresses out the coral reef. So again, you're getting that issue with your fishing, your food security, and your barrier protection. And then obviously on top of that, then you've got the really, really big issues of erosion, submersion, flooding, and salt water getting into aquifers, which means that then the land is uninhabitable anyway because they can't drink, and if you can't drink, you can't stay somewhere. Kiribati and Tuvalu significantly threatened by submersion, like I say, potentially uninhabitable by as soon as 2050, with their populations set to become our first climate refugees. So there's a lot of money going into it at the moment, a lot of programs running to try and adapt and develop resilience within the islands, which first of all, these are great. It's three main areas: coastal zone management, water resource management, and food security. So for addressing the water resources, things like capturing and storing rainwater, saving water, purifying water, and using salt water to irrigate crops. Food security, development of climate-resistant crop species, very important. Using soil-conserving farming to try and stop soil erosion and to keep good quality soil that can bear crops. And improved aquaculture, obviously things like fish aggregation, so encouraging fish to come in to keep that economy flowing. And then coastal area degradation, so protective coastal structures like walls, coastal vegetation, reinforcing the existing coastal infrastructure and reducing coastal mining. And as you can see, a lot of money is going into that, which is great. And there are other things as well. Vanuatu is breeding heat-tolerant pigs, I believe, and looking at solar power. And there's an awful lot of education as well going on for young people and children in the schools in the Pacific Islands around climate disruption and how to adapt to it. But adaptation isn't going to solve islands sinking. It's if those islands are being submerged, like Tuvalu and Kiribati, you can build seawalls, but it's only going to delay the inevitable. So we really need to, whilst everyone's going adapt, we need to still be talking about mitigation, slowing climate change, campaigning against mining and fossil fuels and animal agriculture, and getting everybody to cut down their animal product consumption. Because as we know, if they are in the first wave of climate refugees, refugeeism comes with an enormous impact. First of all, for the people who are refugees, you've got nutrient deficiency, communicable diseases, psychological trauma, loss of culture, everything that we know affects health adversely in refugee populations. We also know that adaptation is challenging, resources are scarce, and health services are strained. And there's also this feeling, bearing in mind that it's the countries like the Pacific Islands who have contributed the least to greenhouse gases who are suffering the most. We're now also trying to put this emphasis of disaster preparedness and recovery onto them rather than the people who are causing it, which just morally seems questionable. I had another point to make there and I've completely forgotten what it is. It'll come to me. This is it. Yes. So, and again, another thing is the economies of these islands can be negatively affected as well by their status as being known to be sinking or submerging or becoming uninhabitable, because how many countries are going to invest in their economies and trade with them and make long-term investments in them or to even help them when they're projected to be uninhabitable. So that again will further impact the lives of the people in the Pacific Islands now, and again spur them to have to move, because if the economies completely drop, then they will have to move. They won't be able to afford to live. Despite all this, the people themselves are really determined to adapt, and certainly don't want to be known as refugees. They, if they are to move, would prefer a planned migration rather than a forced displacement. My argument is, whilst adaptation is currently being financed, it may well be too late. We are on course, and we are not on course for meeting our emissions targets and our temperature targets. So we urgently need to implement planned strategies to minimise global warming and climate disruption, whilst adapting, but also mitigating. So going on specifically now to climate refugeeism. By 2050, there's an estimated 200 million people globally who are going to be displaced by climate change. Now, obviously, this goes outside of the Pacific Islands, and we know that we have huge issues in India, to name but one place as well, and potentially even as westernized as Florida in America, possibly not by 2050, but they are certainly projected to be on the sinking ship as well. Climate disruption is quite a slow process, which has led to a confusion of how to name and term and what category to put people who've been displaced into. So when you've got obviously a sudden catastrophic event, then essentially you do have something that's more like refugeeism, even though the term isn't legally recognised. But certainly with things like salinisation of water or a slow sinking process, you then get into uncharted legal territory. The International Association for the Study of Forced Migration does include those displaced by natural disasters and environmental change as a reason for necessary migration. But the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees states there's increasing difficulties in categorising these people because of conflict, climate disruption and economic pressures. And that statement basically means that we've got so many people that we categorise as refugees anyway. And indeed, as we're all aware, we're in the middle of a refugee crisis, that it's really difficult to start categorising these people when it's a slow process and it's not that necessarily that sudden need to move. So the International Organization for Migration defines environmental refugees, so just different term for the same thing, as those obliged to leave their homes owing to sudden or progressive environmental change that adversely affect their lives or living conditions. So that can be anything from not being able to sustain themselves economically, food security, obviously water supplies, to, you know, literally having water coming up to your knees and you're sinking. And Australia's definition of a refugee is an individual who has left their home owing to fear of racial, religious, social or political persecution, and does not include those displaced by climate. So if you gain legal status as a refugee in Australia, Australia has international obligations to protect the human rights of the refugees arriving in the country, regardless of visa possession. And essentially, they can't be sent back to their country of origin. Now, we know, obviously, with Manus Island, that perhaps Australia's dealing of refugees is not ideal, to say the least. So we have an issue there anyway. Australia has one of the most restrictive immigration detention systems in the world, detaining some refugees without time limit and capacity for people to challenge that in a court of law. So we still need to obviously do much work to care for refugees that are already entering Australia outside of those displaced by climate. Now, obviously, we're on a time limit here because, you know, 2050 is not far away. So it's going to be a case of whatever we can sort out first to save these lives, I guess, and whether we can get them legal acknowledgement as refugees or whether we can develop some other form of planned migration. Providing support to refugees is a challenge. Like I said before, we've currently got 22.5 million refugees. It's worth noting there's actually 65 million people who are displaced on the planet. Outside of that 22.5 million, the rest aren't legally recognised. So we've already got a huge issue with people who are displaced and many of them not recognised. So obviously, if we're adding in climate refugees, 200 million, that's a lot. And how are we going to cope with it? The Nansen Initiative, commenced in 2012, made a start on discussing how we classify people displaced by climate disruption. It's postulated the process could take decades, and I couldn't find anything after 2015. So obviously refugeeism is what we call really a last resort. I mean, obviously if it comes to it, it comes to it, and these people have to go somewhere, and if that's the best that we can do. But the people of the Pacific Islands themselves are reluctant to be termed refugees and would favour a planned migration. Kiribati is home to 100,000 people, Tuvalu 10,000, so migration is likely to be a gradual process. Now again, Australia is quite tight in terms of migration. I'm worried about whether I'm going to get permanent residency. So there is no current specific treaty or plan for emigration of people from the Pacific Islands into Australia. They can come over on the merit-based migration that anyone else from around the world can, which I've come over on. Obviously, the bar is set pretty high. You know, you're looking at people with either a skill, I think, I can't remember which ones are on the list exactly off the top of my head, but I think Sparkies are on the list, I think Butchers are on the list. But certainly otherwise it's tertiary education qualifications, if not higher up to PhD level. So obviously you're talking about a small minority of people who might actually meet the merit-based criteria to move over here and then can move their family over on the basis of family ties. And again, that's not easy to do. So, you know, if you've got your mother and father in their 60s, 70s or 80s, and you're over here, say, with your PhD or whatever, are you going to be able to bring them over? Highly unlikely. If your siblings are over the age of 40, again, highly unlikely to actually get them over here. So it leaves those ineligible to migrate with merit or without good family ties that fall within the visa options, with very few options to migrate over here. Then obviously we've got added issues. So many are really unwilling to leave the islands anyway. They don't want to lose their home, their cultural identity, which is understandable. And then we're adding in an added issue. There was a fairly recent study done on Tuvalu in terms of interviewing the residents there as to what they think about climate change and potentially having to move. And many people are very religious there and believe that because of Noah and the ark, that God won't flood them again, and that, you know, there's nothing bad going to happen because God will protect them. So we've got a huge potential for a crisis here. So ambassadors to the Pacific Islands feel that migration is defeatist, and in terms of the economics that I talked about before, globally irresponsible, and they advocate for mitigation adaptation instead. But we may be too late for that, and certainly if we're not meeting our Paris Agreement, it's going to get too late for that. So I'm arguing that a treaty between the islands and Australia would allow for movement into Australia, access to employment, education, healthcare. Obviously, you've still got the whole issue of displacing from culture, but at least they'll be alive and have somewhere that's functioning food security, water supply. New Zealand's currently leading the way. They are drawing together migration plans with those imminently affected. Some argue that a treaty won't solve the issue, and that we really need to keep on with the measures that we're using to assist those, such as the coastal degradation and the food security. And whilst a treaty mustn't detract from those measures, because obviously, you know, we're going to be seeing more and more effects before we reach the dire emergency. Unless a treaty is going to take time, and unless it's formulated, there are entire populations of people who face losing their homes with little opportunity to rebuild. And we're going to see more and more people getting into boats onto the ocean and not making it across to the mainland or Manus Island. So despite flaws with the treaty-based strategy, it's probably our best way forward. We urgently need a protocol on recognising, resettling and protecting those displaced by climate displaced by climate disruption. So what next? The point of this is really, how can the Public Health Association Australia, and particularly the ESIG, help? My thoughts are things like advocacy, policy writing. We could do with a policy on this, and lobbying politicians, and really just looking for ideas now from the crowd. We've currently got, that paper's just been published. We've currently got another paper under review on this very topic.